On October 30th, 1922, a man with a prominent jaw and defiant gaze marched on Rome leading 40,000 black shirts, armed with clubs, pistols, and limitless ambition. He did not fire a single shot against the Italian army. He did not need to. King Victor Emmanuel III, terrified at the possibility of a civil war, handed him the government on a silver platter. That man was named Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini, and in a matter of hours, he went from being a street agitator to becoming the youngest prime minister in Italy's history. He was 39 years old. More than 700 kilometers away, in a smoky Munich beer hall, a 33-year-old Austrian war veteran with a trimmed moustache and ice-blue eyes read the news in the papers. He remained motionless. Then he carefully folded the newspaper, left it on the table, and uttered a phrase that several of his comrades would remember for decades. What Mussolini has done in Italy, we will do in Bavaria, and then in all of Germany. That veteran was named Adolf Hitler, and that phrase was not an empty wish, it was a prophecy. But how is it possible that a former Italian schoolteacher, the son of a socialist blacksmith from the Emilia-Romagna region, would become the political, strategic, and even aesthetic model for the man who would unleash the Second World War and the Holocaust? What did Hitler see in Mussolini that he found in no other leader of his era? And to what extent was Italian fascism the original mould from which Nazism was extracted? The answer to these questions is more profound, more disturbing, and more documented than most people think, because the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler was not a simple historical coincidence. It was a chain of imitation, admiration, rivalry, and ultimately mutual destruction that changed the course of the 20th century. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world, because what you are about to hear is not just the story of two dictators. It's the story of how a poisonous idea crossed borders, mutated, grew stronger, and ended up setting the entire world on fire. And it all began much earlier than you think. To understand how Mussolini became Hitler's ideological beacon, one must first understand who Benito Mussolini was before he became Il Duce. Because the man who invented fascism was not born a fascist, he was born a socialist. Benito Mussolini came into the world on July 29th, 1883, in Dovia di Predappio, a small town in the province of Forli, in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and a convinced socialist militant. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a primary school teacher, a devout Catholic woman who tried to instill discipline and faith in her children. The tension between these two influences, the father's political radicalism and the mother's moral rigidity, marked Benito's childhood in a way that biographers have noted as fundamental. Alessandro was not a theoretical socialist. He was an activist who organised meetings, distributed pamphlets, and on more than one occasion ended up arrested by the authorities. In the forge where he worked, amidst the heat of the glowing iron and the hammering, he would speak to his eldest son about Karl Marx, about Mikhail Bakunin, about the inevitable revolution of the workers against the capitalists. The very name Benito was chosen in honor of Benito Juarez, the reformist Mexican president who had fought against French intervention, a hero of anti-imperialist liberalism. Amilcare paid homage to Amilcare Cipriani, an Italian patriot and revolutionary, and Andrea recalled Andrea Costa, one of the founders of Italian socialism. From birth, Mussolini carried the revolution inscribed in his name. But young Benito was not an easy child. He was violent, impulsive and quarrelsome. At his mother's school, he was expelled for stabbing a classmate with a penknife. He was 10. In another religious boarding school, he again attacked a classmate with a knife and was expelled again. The priests who ran the school described him as incorrigible. His mother wept. His father shrugged and said the boy had character. What kind of character leads a 10-year-old boy to stab another? Was he simply a village bully? Or was there something deeper? Something that years later he would channel into politics with devastating results? What is certain is that Mussolini, despite his explosive temperament, was intelligent. He read voraciously. He devoured the books his father brought home, texts by Marx, Proudhon, Sorel, and Nietzsche. Yes, Nietzsche, the German philosopher who spoke of the Superman, of the individual who rises above conventional morality, who imposes his will on the world. Mussolini was fascinated by that idea. He mixed it with his father's socialism, with the activism of the Italian streets, with his own inner rage, and began to forge something that was neither pure socialism nor pure Nietzscheanism, but an explosive amalgam that did not yet have a name. At 18, Mussolini obtained his teaching diploma and got a job as an elementary school teacher in a village. But teaching did not satisfy him. He felt suffocated by the routine, by the mediocrity of provincial life. In 1902, he fled to Switzerland. He literally fled. He crossed the border without money, without contacts, without a plan. He slept under bridges, begged for food, worked sporadically as a bricklayer or labourer. The Swiss police arrested him several times for vagrancy, but in Switzerland, he also discovered something that would transform his life: organised political agitation. In Swiss cities lived thousands of Italian emigrants who worked in miserable conditions. Mussolini began to organise them, to give speeches at union meetings, to write articles for socialist newspapers. He discovered he had a gift. He was not just intelligent, he was magnetic. When he spoke, people listened. When he shouted, people obeyed. When he pounded the table with his fist, the workers stood up and applauded. In Switzerland, Mussolini also met several important socialist leaders, including Angelika Balabanov, a Russian-Ukrainian intellectual who would become one of the key figures of international socialism. Balabanov would later recall that Mussolini was a man of extreme passions and superficial convictions, someone capable of defending an idea with ferocity in the morning and abandoning it in the afternoon if it suited him. A prophetic observation. But at that moment, Mussolini seemed a genuine socialist. He attacked capitalism, the army, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church. He wrote articles where he called God an invention of the priests to keep the people asleep. He was expelled from 2 Swiss cantons for political agitation. The Italian authorities flagged him as a dangerous subversive. When he returned to Italy in 1904, he completed his mandatory military service, which is ironic for a man who at that time declared himself an anti-militarist. He then briefly resumed teaching and continued writing for socialist publications. His pen was sharp, provocative, relentless. He did not write like an academic. He wrote like an agitator, with short sentences, rhetorical blows, and insults aimed at his enemies. That direct, visceral, emotional style distinguished him from the rest of the Italian socialist intellectuals, who tended toward long theoretical essays. In 1910, Mussolini became secretary of the Socialist Federation of Forlì and founded a newspaper called La Lotta di Classe, the class struggle. Its circulation was modest, but his articles resonated with the workers and peasants of the region. Mussolini did not just write about the class struggle, he lived it, he represented it, he embodied it with his dishevelled appearance, his fiery speeches, and his attitude of eternal rebellion. And then came a moment that catapulted him to stardom within the Italian Socialist Party. In 1911, Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire to conquer Libya. The liberal government of Giovanni Giolitti presented the war as a patriotic, civilizing enterprise, necessary for Italy's prestige as a Mediterranean power. Most politicians, including many socialists, were lukewarm or ambiguous. Mussolini was not. He opposed it with all his might. He organised violent demonstrations against the war in Forlì. He led a general strike. He sabotaged train tracks to prevent the transport of troops. He was arrested and sentenced to 5 months in prison. When he got out of jail, he was a hero to the Italian radical left, a martyr, a man willing to go to prison for his convictions. At the 1912 Congress of the Socialist Party, Mussolini led the expulsion of the party's reformist wing, the moderate socialists, who had supported or tolerated the war in Libya. It was a bold move that left the party in the hands of the radicals, with Mussolini at the top. At 29, he was appointed editor of Avanti, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, the most important left-wing daily in the entire country. Under his direction, the circulation of Avanti doubled. Mussolini turned the newspaper into a weapon. Every issue was an attack against the government, against the capitalists, against the clergy, against the nationalists. Mussolini preached revolution, not reform. He wanted to tear down the system, not improve it, and thousands of people followed him. But here comes one of the most extraordinary betrayals in modern political history. Because the man who had gone to prison for opposing the war, the socialist leader who wrote incendiary articles against militarism, the declared pacifist who sabotaged military trains, that same man, in a matter of months, would make a 180-degree turn so abrupt it would leave all of Italy stunned. What made him change? What can transform an anti-militarist socialist leader into a nationalist warmonger practically overnight? The answer has a date: July 28, 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. When the European powers plunged into war in the summer of 1914, Italy found itself in a peculiar position. It was formerly a member of the Triple Alliance, along with Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Italian government declared itself neutral. The alliance was defensive, argued the Italian diplomats, and since Austria-Hungary had initiated hostilities by attacking Serbia, Italy was not obliged to intervene. Mussolini was first. Hitler watched and learned. But the question is, without Mussolini, would Nazism have existed? Let me know your opinion in the comments. The country was divided into two furious factions. On one side, the neutralists, socialists, conservative Catholics, many liberals, and peasants who did not want to go die in the trenches. On the other, the interventionists, nationalists, irredentists, who wanted to reclaim Trieste and Trentino from Austria, revolutionary syndicalists, who saw the war as an opportunity to accelerate the revolution, and a heterogeneous group of intellectuals who considered the war a test of national virility. Mussolini, as editor of Avanti, initially sided with the neutralists. The Socialist Party had a clear position. The war was a conflict between capitalists, and the workers of all countries should refuse to kill each other for the interests of the bourgeoisie. Mussolini published fierce articles against intervention. "Down with the war" was the most frequent headline. But something was changing inside him. As the weeks and months passed, Mussolini began to doubt. Not publicly, not yet, but in private, in conversations with friends and lovers, he expressed a growing unease. What if the war was really an opportunity? What if neutrality condemned Italy to irrelevance? And what if the revolution he dreamed of could only be born from the chaos of war? Historians have debated for decades what exactly motivated Mussolini's change. Some point to his personal ambitions. Socialism had given him fame, but not real power, and the war could open doors that party politics kept closed. Others point to intellectual influences. Mussolini was increasingly fascinated by the revolutionary syndicalism of George Sorel, who exalted violence as a regenerative force, and by the Italian futurists of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who glorified war as the world's only hygiene. There is also evidence that he received money from French and British sources, interested in Italy entering the war on the Entente's side, although the exact extent of these payments remains a subject of controversy. Whatever the reason, or more likely the combination of all of them, on October 18, 1914, Mussolini published an article in Avanti that shook the Italian Socialist Party like an earthquake. The article was titled, from absolute neutrality to active and operative neutrality. In it, Mussolini argued that Italian socialists could not stand idly by while France, the homeland of the revolution, was crushed by Prussian militarism. Italy had to intervene, not for bourgeois patriotism, but for revolutionary solidarity. The scandal was monumental. His party comrades accused him of being a traitor, of having sold out, of having been bought by the French imperialists. Mussolini was dismissed. As editor of Avanti, in a tumultuous session filled with shouts, shoves, and tears, he was expelled from the Italian Socialist Party on November 24th, 1914. The man who weeks before had been the undisputed star of the Italian left suddenly found himself alone, repudiated, without a party, newspaper, or platform. And what did he do? What any natural-born demagogue would do. He created his own platform. On November 15th, 1914, just a week before his formal expulsion from the party, Mussolini founded a new newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy. The name was significant. It was no longer the class struggle, it was the people. Mussolini was abandoning proletarian internationalism for popular nationalism. The newspaper's subtitle read, Socialist Daily, but it had less and less to do with socialism. Where did the money come from to found a newspaper in the middle of a war? This is one of the most fascinating and murky questions in the entire history of fascism. The sources are contradictory, but the most solid evidence suggests that Mussolini received funding from various sources. Italian industrialists, who wanted the war for military contracts, the French government through intermediaries, and possibly also British intelligence services. Mussolini never admitted it, of course. He always maintained that the newspaper was financed by the subscriptions of patriotic workers, but the numbers don't add up, and declassified documents decades later tell another story. What is indisputable is that Il Popolo d'Italia quickly became the most strident megaphone for Italian interventionism. Mussolini wrote with the same ferocity as before, but now his targets were different. The neutralists, the socialists who had expelled him, the cowardly pacifists who wanted Italy to stand aside while Europe burned. Italy entered the war in May 1915, on the side of the Entente, after signing the secret Treaty of London, which promised it Austro-Hungarian territories in exchange for its participation. Mussolini celebrated, and he wasn't content to celebrate from the newspaper's editorial office. He enlisted as a volunteer in the Italian army. We must pause for a moment here, because this detail is crucial to understanding the later relationship with Hitler. Mussolini fought in the trenches of the Isonzo front, one of the most brutal areas of the entire First World War. The Italo-Austrian front was a slaughterhouse. 12 battles of the Isonzo between 1915 and 1917. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. Advances measured in meters over mountainous terrain, under rain, mud, and artillery fire. Mussolini was first a corporal, then a sergeant. According to military records and testimonies of his comrades, he was a competent, though not exceptional soldier. He wrote letters and articles from the front that he published in his newspaper, mixing war chronicles with patriotic propaganda. In February 1917, a mortar exploded during a training exercise and Mussolini was wounded. He received more than 40 shrapnel fragments in his body. He was hospitalized for months. The wound was real and serious, but Mussolini turned it into a foundational myth. The leader who had shed his blood for Italy, the man who knew war not from reading it in books, but from having lived it in his own flesh. While Mussolini was recovering in a Milan hospital, hundreds of kilometers away, on the Western Front, another wounded corporal lay in another hospital. His name was Adolf Hitler. He had been gassed in a mustard gas attack near Ypres, Belgium, in October 1918. He was temporarily blind, and when he regained his sight, he learned that Germany had signed the armistice. It had lost the war. 2 wounded corporals, 2 furious men, 2 colossal ambitions born from the same cataclysm. But one of them would act first, and the other would take notes. What exactly did Hitler see in Mussolini? What made him look to Italy with such admiration? To answer this question, one must understand the state of Germany after the First World War and the void that Hitler needed to fill. When the war ended in November 1918, Germany was a shattered country. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The Weimar Republic was proclaimed a fragile democratic regime, born of chaos and rejected by both the far left and the far right. The communists, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, attempted a Bolshevik-style revolution in Berlin in January 1919. They were crushed by the Freikorps, far-right paramilitary militias formed by war veterans who hated both communism and liberal democracy equally. In Bavaria, the situation was even more chaotic. In April 1919, a group of anarchists and communists proclaimed the Bavarian Soviet Republic, an ephemeral revolutionary experiment that lasted less than a month before being destroyed by the regular army and the Freikorps, leaving a trail of blood and a fierce hatred for the radical left throughout the region. Hitler was in Munich during these events. He was still a nobody, a demobilized corporal without a job, without formal education, without a family, without prospects. But the army had detected him as a man with a gift for words and recruited him as an education agent, that is, an informant and propagandist, whose task was to monitor the numerous extremist political parties that swarmed in Munich like mushrooms after the rain. It was in this capacity that Hitler attended, on September 12, 1919, a meeting of a tiny group called the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, founded by a locksmith named Anton Drexler. The party had a few dozen members, no money, no headquarters, no clear program. But when Hitler took the floor to rebut a speaker who had proposed the separation of Bavaria from Germany, something extraordinary happened. He spoke with a passion, a vehemence, and a conviction that left those present dumbfounded. Drexler approached him after the meeting and gave him a pamphlet titled My Political Awakening. He begged him to come back. Hitler returned, and in a few weeks, he became member number 555 of the DAP, although the numbering started at 500 to give an impression of greater size. The real number of members when Hitler joined probably did not exceed 60. It didn't matter. Hitler saw in that tiny party a huge opportunity, a structure that he could mould to his image and likeness, a vehicle for his ideas, a springboard for his ambition. And this is where Mussolini enters the scene, not physically, not yet, but as a model, as an inspiration, as the living example that a single man with sufficient will could take over an entire country. Because while Hitler was taking his first clumsy steps in Bavarian politics, Mussolini was building something in Italy that had never been seen before, the first fascist movement in history. On March 23, 1919, just 4 months after the end of the war, Mussolini gathered a heterogeneous group of about 100 people in a space provided by the Circle of the Industrial and Commercial Alliance in Milan's Piazza San Sepolcro. There were war veterans, revolutionary syndicalists, futurists, nationalists, anarchists, and a few adventurers without a defined ideology. Mussolini christened them the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, Italian Fighting Leagues. The word fascio came from the Latin fasces, the bundle of rods tied around an axe that symbolized authority in ancient Rome, unity, strength, power. The original program of the Fasci was surprisingly eclectic, almost contradictory. It included left-wing demands, such as universal suffrage, including for women, the 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, workers' participation in factory management, and the partial confiscation of war fortunes. But it also included right-wing demands, the exaltation of the nation, territorial expansionism, the rejection of socialist internationalism, and an aggressive nationalism that glorified war and sacrifice. How could a movement be of the left and the right at the same time? That was precisely Mussolini's innovation, to break with traditional political categories. Fascism was not situated on the conventional political spectrum. It transcended it, or at least pretended to. It took what served it from the left, mass mobilization, anti-capitalist rhetoric, paramilitary organization, and what served it from the right, nationalism, hierarchy, the cult of the leader, contempt for parliamentary democracy, and fused it into something new, something Mussolini defined not so much by what it was as by what it rejected. It rejected liberalism. It rejected communism. It rejected traditional conservatism. It was, according to its own creator, a third way. And that third way had an essential ingredient that distinguished it from any other political movement of the era: organized violence as a legitimate political tool. One man creates the master plan, another turns it into a nightmare. Do you think Hitler improved Mussolini's system or corrupted it beyond recognition? I want to know your opinion. The squadristi, the fascist action squads, were gangs of uniformed thugs in black shirts who roamed the streets of the cities and the countryside of northern Italy, attacking socialists, communists, trade unionists, and anyone who opposed the movement. They would set fire to the headquarters of left-wing parties, beat up union leaders, force their victims to drink castor oil as a public humiliation, and in no few cases, they would beat or shoot their opponents to death. All this happened in broad daylight, with the passive or active complicity of the police, the army, and the landowners, who saw the fascists as a shield against the Bolshevik Revolution. Between 1919 and 1922, Italy experienced what historians call the Biennio Rosso, the 2 Red Years, a period of massive labour unrest with general strikes, factory occupations, and peasant uprisings that terrified the bourgeoisie and the middle classes. The socialists and communists were strong but divided, and the liberal government was unable to maintain order. In that vacuum, the fascists presented themselves as the restorers of order, the defenders of the homeland against Bolshevik chaos. It was a brilliant lie, because the fascists did not restore order. They destroyed it first in order to then present themselves as saviours. They provoked violence to justify more violence. They created the problem and then sold the solution. It was one of the first large-scale applications of what we would today call a shock strategy, and it worked to perfection. By 1921, the fascist movement had more than 200,000 members. In November of that year, Mussolini formally transformed it into the National Fascist Party, PNF. It was no longer an amorphous movement. It was a political machine with a hierarchical structure, paramilitary discipline, and an undisputed leader. And that leader had a plan that would change the history of Europe, a plan that a young agitator in Munich was observing with feverish attention. But how did Hitler find out what Mussolini was doing in Italy? Did he read Italian newspapers? Did he have contacts in Rome? Or did he simply absorb information from the political atmosphere of the time? The answer is all of the above and more. Munich in the early 1920s was a cosmopolitan city where newspapers in various languages circulated and where political exiles from half of Europe exchanged ideas, conspiracies, and rumours in cafes and beer halls. Hitler did not speak Italian, but he didn't need to. German newspapers extensively covered events in Italy, and Mussolini's fascist movement was constant news. Furthermore, Munich hosted a community of Italian emigrants and Italian fascists who maintained contact with their comrades in Italy. But there was an even more direct link. His name was Kurt Ludecker, an adventurer and con man, with an aristocratic bearing who had become one of Mussolini's first international admirers. Ludecker had travelled to Italy, attended fascist rallies, met Mussolini personally, and returned to Germany dazzled. When he heard Hitler speak in a Munich beer hall, he believed he had found the German Mussolini. He approached Hitler and became a sort of unofficial ambassador between the Italian fascists and the incipient Nazis. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment with the phrase, "I want more stories." This will encourage us to bring more historical topics and also help with video engagement, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube keeps recommending our videos. Through Ludecker and other intermediaries, Hitler received detailed information about Mussolini's tactics, how he organised the squads, how he financed the movement, how he managed the press, how he intimidated his opponents, how he negotiated with the established powers. Hitler absorbed everything like a sponge. But he didn't just absorb the tactics, he absorbed the concept itself. The idea that a mass movement, led by a charismatic man, could take power not through elections or an armed revolution, but through a combination of street violence, mass propaganda, and negotiation with the established elites. That idea did not exist before Mussolini. Mussolini invented it, and Hitler copied it. The parallels between Italian fascism and Nazism in their formative stages are so numerous and so evident that it is impossible to attribute them to coincidence. Let's look at the most significant ones. Mussolini had the black shirts. Hitler created the brown shirts, the SA, Sturmabteilung, a paramilitary militia modelled explicitly on the Italian squadristi. Both organisations fulfilled the same function: to intimidate opponents, protect party rallies, create an atmosphere of force and martial discipline, and provide an outlet for the violent energy of thousands of unemployed and resentful young war veterans. Mussolini called himself Il Duce, the leader. Hitler would call himself Der Führer, the leader. Both titles essentially meant the same thing: the supreme leader, the man whose word was law, the undisputed chief to whom absolute obedience was owed. Mussolini used the Roman salute, the outstretched arm. Hitler adopted the same gesture, which would become the infamous Heil Hitler. Mussolini organised spectacular mass rallies, with military parades, uniforms, flags, torches, and thundering speeches. Hitler would do the same, taking it to an even grander scale with the Nuremberg rallies. Mussolini controlled the press through his newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia and the direct intimidation of journalists. Hitler would found the Völkischer Beobachter as the party's official organ and would develop an unprecedented propaganda apparatus under the direction of Joseph Goebbels. Mussolini combined socialist rhetoric with aggressive nationalism. Hitler would do exactly the same, mixing labour demands with racial supremacism and territorial expansionism. The very name of Hitler's party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, is a reflection of this synthesis. National and socialist in the same name, exactly as Mussolini had fused the two currents. The similarities were not coincidental. Hitler openly acknowledged this on multiple occasions during the early years of the Nazi movement. In private conversations, in public speeches, and in his writings, Hitler expressed his admiration for Mussolini and his desire to replicate in Germany what Il Duce had achieved in Italy. Ernst Hamstengel, a close friend of Hitler in the early 20s, a man of German-American origin who came from a family of art publishers, recalled in his memoirs that Hitler constantly talked about Mussolini. He was his hero, Hamstengel wrote. He had a photo of Mussolini on his desk. He studied it like a general studies the maps of the battlefield. Hermann Esser, another early Nazi, confirmed in later interviews that Hitler considered the March on Rome the perfect model for taking power, not a bloody revolution like the Bolsheviks, but a show of force that would force the establishment to yield without a fight. And how did Hitler try to replicate the March on Rome? The answer is found in a Munich beer hall on the night of November 8th, 1923. But before we get there, we need to understand the context that made that desperate attempt possible. In 1923, Germany was on the brink of abyss. Hyperinflation had destroyed the currency. $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks by November of that year. The middle class's savings evaporated overnight. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People transported money in wheelbarrows and burned it for heat because the paper money was worth less than coal. Wages were paid twice a day so workers could spend the money before it lost its value. Simultaneously, France and Belgium had militarily occupied the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland, in retaliation for Germany's delay in paying the war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar government called for passive resistance, a general strike, which paralysed production but accelerated the economic catastrophe. Resentment against the Treaty of Versailles, against the Allies, against the Weimar government that had accepted the terms of defeat was volcanic. In Bavaria, the regional government under State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr had adopted a posture of defiance against Berlin. Kahr was a nationalist conservative who sympathised with the far right, but was not willing to risk his neck in a putschist adventure. Hitler, however, was convinced that the moment had come. If Mussolini had marched on Rome just a year ago and taken over Italy, why couldn't he march on Berlin and take over Germany? Hitler's admiration for Mussolini in this period was no secret. It was an obsession. According to historian Ian Kershaw, author of the most exhaustive biography of Hitler, the future Führer spoke of the March on Rome as if it were a sacred text. He studied every detail, how Mussolini had mobilized his squads, how he had negotiated with the military, how he had pressured the king, how he had presented his coup not as an insurrection, but as a national revolution that saved Italy from chaos. Hitler wanted to do the same. His plan was to capture the leaders of the Bavarian government, force them to support a coup against Berlin, march north with the support of the army and right-wing paramilitary groups, and establish a nationalist government with himself as political leader and General Erich Ludendorff, hero of the First World War, as military leader. On November 8, 1923, Kahr was giving a speech at the Bürgerbraukeller, a huge Munich beer hall, before some 3,000 people. Hitler burst into the hall with a group of armed brown shirts. He fired a shot into the ceiling with his pistol and shouted, "The national revolution has begun." What followed was a disaster. Kahr and the other officials, forced at gunpoint to declare their support, recanted as soon as they had the chance. The army did not join the coup. The Bavarian police did not scatter as Hitler had expected. The next day, when Hitler and Ludendorff led a march of about 2,000 men through the streets of Munich toward the city centre, state police opened fire at the Feldherrnhalle. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died. Hitler dropped to the ground, dislocated his shoulder, and fled. He was arrested 2 days later, hiding in the country house of Ernst Hanfstaengl. The beer hall putsch, as it is known in history, was a resounding failure. The Bavarian imitation of the March on Rome had ended in blood, humiliation, and jail. But was it really a failure? Or was it, paradoxically, the event that transformed Hitler from a regional agitator into a figure of national scope? Because what came after the putsch was something that neither Hitler nor Mussolini could have foreseen. The trial. Hitler was tried for high treason in February and March 1924. In any other country, in any other circumstance, a man accused of trying to overthrow the legitimate government by force would have been condemned to the maximum penalty and erased from public life. But Weimar Germany was not just any country, and the court that tried Hitler was not just any court. Judge Georg Neithardt was a conservative nationalist who sympathised with the conspirators. He allowed Hitler to turn the trial into a propaganda stage. Instead of defending his innocence, Hitler proudly proclaimed his guilt. Yes, he had tried to overthrow the government, and he would do it again. Because the Weimar government was illegitimate, a puppet of the victors of Versailles, a stab in the back to the German people. The true traitor was not him, Hitler, but the government that had signed the surrender. The journalists present transmitted his words to the whole country. Suddenly, an obscure Bavarian politician appeared in the headlines of all German newspapers. His rhetoric was incendiary, but also calculated. He presented himself not as a putschist, but as a patriot, a man willing to sacrifice everything for Germany. And millions of Germans, embittered by defeat, inflation, and national humiliation, heard his words and thought, "This man says what I feel." The sentence was a farce. Hitler was condemned to 5 years in prison, the minimum penalty for high treason. But he did not even serve 5 years. He was released after only 13 months, on December 20th, 1924, and during those 13 months, confined in the relatively comfortable prison of Landsberg am Lech, where he had his own cell, received visitors, read books, and enjoyed a view of the garden, Hitler did something that would have incalculable consequences. He wrote a book, or more accurately, he dictated a book to his personal secretary, Rudolf Hess, who was imprisoned with him. The book would be published in 2 volumes, in 1925 and 1926, under a title that his publisher shortened from Hitler's original proposal. The original title was 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity and Cowardice. The editor reduced it to 2 words, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in the pages of Mein Kampf, amidst the anti-Semitic diatribes, the pseudo-scientific racial theories, the delusions of grandeur, and the autobiographical reflections, Hitler dedicated numerous passages to his admiration for Mussolini and for the Italian fascist model. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote about the importance of mass propaganda, the use of symbols and rituals to create emotional unity, the need for a charismatic leader who would embody the will of the people, the creation of disciplined paramilitary organizations, and the contempt for parliamentary democracy. All these ideas had a direct and recognizable precedent in Mussolini's practice. Hitler did not copy Mussolini textually, of course, but the influence was transparent. There is a particularly revealing passage in Mein Kampf where Hitler talks about Italian fascism. Referring to the March on Rome, he wrote that Mussolini had shown it was possible to confront international Marxism with an organized national force, and that Italy was an example of how the will of a single man could overcome corrupt parliamentarianism. Hitler added that Italian fascism had inspired the National Socialist movement, although he also claimed that Nazism was an independent creation, adapted to the specific conditions of Germany. That last statement was a half-truth. Nazism was certainly a creation adapted to Germany, but its debt to Italian fascism was enormous. Without Mussolini, Nazism would probably have existed in some form, because the social, economic, and political conditions of Germany would have produced some kind of far-right movement. But without the Italian fascist model, Nazism would not have had the specific form it took. The combination of a mass party, paramilitary militia, cult of the leader, and third-way rhetoric between capitalism and communism that defined it. Mussolini was the prototype. Hitler was the improved copy, or more accurately, the radicalized copy. Because there is a fundamental difference between the original Italian fascism and the Nazism that emerged from it, a difference that would mark the destiny of millions of people. That difference has a name: racial anti-Semitism. Why was original Italian fascism not anti-Semitic while Nazism was from the beginning? This is one of the most important questions for understanding the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler, and the answer reveals as much about the roots of Nazism as it does about those of fascism. Mussolini, in his early years as a fascist leader, was not anti-Semitic. In fact, several of the first Italian fascists were Jews. Aldo Finzi, an aviator and politician, was one of the members of the first fascist Grand Council. Margherita Sarfatti, one of the most influential intellectuals of the fascist movement, and Mussolini's lover for years, was Jewish. Guido Jung was Mussolini's Minister of Finance between 1932 and 1935. Original Italian fascism was nationalist, authoritarian, violent, and anti-democratic, but it was not racist in the biological sense. Mussolini despised socialists, liberals, Democrats, and pacifists, but he did not classify humanity into superior and inferior races. In a famous 1932 declaration, Mussolini said, "Race is a feeling, not a reality. 95% of race is feeling." On another occasion, he openly mocked biological racism as stupidity. Hitler, in contrast, placed biological racism at the absolute centre of his ideology. For Hitler, human history was a struggle between races, not between classes as the Marxists said, nor between nations as conventional nationalists said. The Aryan race was the superior race, the creator of all civilization. The Jews were the inferior race, the destroyer of civilizations, a parasite that infected nations from within. And the mission of Nazism was to purify Germany of the Jewish contamination and establish the dominion of the Aryan race over the world. Where did Hitler get these ideas? Not from Mussolini. The roots of Hitler's racial anti-Semitism are multiple and profound. The Christian anti-Semitism that for centuries had blamed the Jews for the death of Christ. The political anti-Semitism that accused them of controlling finance and the press. The pseudoscientific theories of the 19th century on racial hierarchy, such as those of the Count de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain. The protocols of the Elders of Sion, a Tsarist forgery that purported to prove a worldwide Jewish conspiracy, and Hitler's personal experience in early 20th century Vienna, where Mayor Karl Lueger used anti-Semitism as a successful electoral tool. Hitler fused all this with the organisational and political model that Mussolini had invented. He took the structure of Italian fascism, the paramilitary organisation, the cult of the leader, the mass propaganda, the contempt for democracy, and injected it with a lethal dose of biological racism that Mussolini had never contemplated. It's as if Mussolini had built a weapon and Hitler had loaded it with a much more deadly munition than the original manufacturer had foreseen. And what was Mussolini's reaction to this imitation? Did he feel flattered, worried, irritated? All three, and at different times. In the early years, the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler was asymmetrical. Mussolini was the master, Hitler the disciple. Mussolini was the prime minister of a European nation. Hitler was a coup-plotting agitator who had just been released from prison. The status difference was abysmal. Mussolini was aware of the admiration Hitler professed for him, and he enjoyed it with a mixture of complacency and condescension. When people spoke to him about Hitler, Mussolini would often smile smugly and say something like, "Ah, yes, that fellow from Munich who imitates my methods." For Mussolini, Hitler was a minor epigon, a provincial imitator who would never achieve the stature of the original. But there was also a strategic dimension. Mussolini saw in the Nazi movement a potential ally, a brother movement that could contribute to his own geopolitical ambitions. A Germany governed by a regime akin to Italian fascism could be a valuable ally in European politics, especially against France and Great Britain. So Mussolini maintained contacts with the Nazis, received emissaries like Ludecker, and provided some support, especially moral and propagandistic, to the Nazi movement in its early years. However, the relationship was quickly complicated by an explosive geopolitical issue: Austria. Austria, Hitler's native country, was a small state created after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Millions of German speakers lived in Austria, and many of them, including Hitler himself, dreamed of unification with Germany, which was known as the Anschluss. For Hitler, the union of Austria with Germany was a fundamental objective. It meant the reunification of all Germanic peoples under a single state, the first step toward the creation of Greater Germany. But for Mussolini, the independence of Austria was a matter of national security. Austria was the buffer state between Italy and Germany. If Germany annexed Austria, the Brenner Pass border, which separated Italy from Austria, would become the direct border between Italy and a hugely strengthened German Reich. And that was something Mussolini could not allow. Moreover, Mussolini had established a close relationship with Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a conservative and authoritarian politician who had established a corporatist dictatorship. Inspired in part by the Italian fascist model, Dollfuss, in turn, depended on Mussolini's support to resist German pressure and to repress the growing Austrian Nazi movement. This tension between Hitler's ideological admiration for Mussolini and the geopolitical rivalry over Austria would be one of the dominant themes in the relationship between the two dictators during the 1930s, and it would culminate in an episode that almost destroyed their relationship forever. But before we get there, we must tell how Hitler finally achieved power in Germany, and how once again he followed the script that Mussolini had written. After the failure of the beer hall putsch, Hitler changed his strategy. He understood that he could not take power by force, at least not directly. He needed a path that combined formal legality with extra-legal pressure. And once again, the model was Mussolini. Because the March on Rome, if examined carefully, was not really a military coup. It was an act of political intimidation. The black shirts marched on Rome, yes, but the Italian army could have easily stopped them. What happened was that Mussolini pressured the political system until it collapsed, combining the threat of violence with negotiation with the economic, military, and monarchical elites. The king appointed Mussolini prime minister, not because the fascists had conquered Rome by fire and sword, but because the Italian establishment decided it was preferable to give him power to control him than to risk an open confrontation. Hitler did exactly the same, although it took him longer. After getting out of prison, he refounded the Nazi Party and began to build it into an electoral machine. He ran in elections, created youth and women's organizations, professional groups, and penetrated all sectors of German society. The SA continued to operate as a force of intimidation in the streets, but the objective was no longer to take power by assault, but to reach it through the front door and then bolt it from the inside. Hitler reorganized the party with almost military discipline. He created regional structures, the so-called Gau, each led by a Gauleiter loyal directly to him. He established organizations for youth, for women, for teachers, for lawyers, for doctors, for farmers. Every sector of German society would have its Nazi arm. The party ceased to be a Bavarian beer hall club and became a massive recruitment machine that covered all of Germany like a spider's web. But there was a problem. In the late 1920s, Germany was recovering. Hyperinflation had been controlled thanks to the 1924 Dawes Plan, which restructured war reparations and channeled American loans into the German economy. The Weimar Republic experienced what historians call the Golden Years, a period of relative economic stability, cultural flourishing, and political normalization between 1924 and 1929. In these conditions, Hitler's extremist message had limited reach. In the May 1928 elections, the Nazi Party obtained just 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats in the Reichstag. It was a marginal party. And then, like a poisoned gift from fate, came the catastrophe Hitler needed. On October 24th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. The Black Thursday and Black Tuesday that followed unleashed a chain reaction that destroyed the world economy. And no country in Europe was hit as brutally as Germany, whose recovery depended almost entirely on the American loans that now evaporated. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared from less than 2 million to more than 6 million in 3 years. Entire families were left on the street. Endless lines of desperate men in front of employment offices became the daily image of German cities. The Great Depression was for Hitler what the crisis of the Biennio Rosso had been for Mussolini, the fuel that fed the fire. And Hitler, who had meticulously studied how Mussolini took advantage of the Italian chaos to come to power, applied the same lessons with devastating effectiveness. Nazi propaganda, increasingly sophisticated under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, hammered home a simple and repetitive message. The Weimar Republic was guilty of the German people's misery. The Jews and communists were conspiring to destroy Germany. Only Hitler could save the nation. Nazi rallies became massive spectacles with flags, torches, martial music, and hypnotic speeches. The SA paraded through the streets, projecting an image of order and strength that contrasted with the surrounding chaos. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party jumped from 2.6% to 18.3% of the vote, obtaining 107 seats. Overnight, it went from being a marginal party to the second largest in the Reichstag. In July 1932, it reached 37.3%, becoming the most voted for party in Germany. It did not have an absolute majority, but it was the dominant political force in a fragmented parliament where no other party could form a government. And how did Hitler make the final leap from leader of the largest party to Chancellor of Germany? Exactly as Mussolini had made the leap from leader of the fascists to Prime Minister of Italy, through a combination of pressure, intimidation, and negotiation with the elites, who believed they could control him. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, an 85-year-old field marshal, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. He did not do it because he admired Hitler. He did it because a group of conservative politicians, led by Franz von Papen, convinced him that Hitler could be tamed. They would put him at the head of the government, surrounded by conservative ministers, and use him as a tool to control the masses, while they governed from behind the scenes. Von Papen uttered a phrase that would become one of the most tragically mistaken in history. "We have hired him." It was exactly the same mistake the Italian elites had made with Mussolini 11 years earlier. King Victor Emmanuel III, the industrialists, the generals, the Italian liberal politicians, all believed they could use Mussolini as a temporary instrument to re-establish order and then discard him when he was no longer useful. They were wrong, and the German elites were wrong in the same way. Because what Mussolini did in Italy between 1922 and 1925, dismantling democracy piece by piece, Hitler did in Germany between 1933 and 1934, but much faster, and with a brutality that surpassed even the Italian model. How fast can a democracy die? In the case of Germany, the answer is in weeks. On February 27th, 1933, less than a month after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag burned in flames. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene of the fire and confessed to having started it. The Nazis immediately accused the Communist Party of having organised the fire as a prelude to a revolution. To this day, historians debate whether the Nazis themselves caused the fire or simply took advantage of it. What is not in doubt is what came next. The day after the fire, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy of communications, protection against searches and arbitrary confiscations, all abolished with the stroke of a pen. Thousands of communists, social democrats and opponents were arrested and sent to improvised concentration camps. The first of them, Dachau, opened its doors on March 22, 1933, just 2 months after Hitler's rise to power. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the power to govern by decree for 4 years, without the need for parliamentary approval. The Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists could not even vote because they were in prison or on the run. The centre and right-wing parties voted in favour, intimidated by the SA surrounding the building and by Hitler's promise to respect the rights of the president, the churches and the Reichstag. Promises that were not worth the paper they were written on. By July 1933, all political parties except the Nazi Party were banned. The trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front, controlled by the party. The free press disappeared. The regional governments were subjected to central control. Germany became a one-party state in less than 6 months. And then came the night that consolidated Hitler's absolute power, the night of the long knives. On June 30th, 1934, Hitler ordered the assassination of Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, and dozens of other members of his own party, as well as conservatives, rivals, and personal enemies. Röhm was an old comrade of Hitler. He had marched by his side in the beer hall putsch. He had built up the SA into a force of millions of men, But Röhm wanted the SA to replace the regular army, and that alarmed the generals of the Reichswehr, whose support Hitler needed. Moreover, Röhm spoke of a second revolution that threatened the interests of the industrialists and landowners who financed the party. Hitler solved the problem in the most expedient way possible, with a bloodbath. In a single night, squads of the SS, Hitler's personal guard commanded by Heinrich Himmler, assassinated between 85 and 200 people, depending on the sources. Röhm was shot in his cell after refusing to commit suicide. Gregor Strasser, a former rival of Hitler within the party, was riddled with bullets. Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor, was murdered along with his wife in their own home. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the same Bavarian commissioner who had betrayed Hitler during the Beer Hall Putsch 11 years earlier, was found hacked to death in a swamp near Dachau. It was a massive assassination ordered by the head of government of a European nation, and there were no consequences. The army did not protest. The courts did not act. President Hindenburg congratulated Hitler for having suppressed the treason. The Reichstag retroactively approved the executions as a legal measure of defense of the state. When Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, assumed supreme command of the armed forces, and proclaimed himself Führer and Chancellor of the Reich. Every German soldier had to swear an oath of personal loyalty, not to the constitution, not to the nation, but to Adolf Hitler as a person. German democracy was dead, and on its ashes rose a regime that had followed, step by step, the path Mussolini had traced in Italy, but had travelled it faster, farther, and with infinitely more deadly consequences. Now, what was Mussolini's reaction to all this? How did the master feel seeing his student surpassing him? The relationship between Mussolini and Hitler in 1933 and 1934 was an explosive mix of pride, distrust, rivalry, and strategic necessity. Mussolini saw in Hitler's rise the confirmation of his own political genius. If fascism was expanding to Germany, the greatest power in continental Europe, that meant that the model he had invented was universal, that he, Mussolini, was not just the dictator of Italy, but the prophet of a new world political era. Mussolini publicly praised Hitler's rise to power in 1933, describing it as a victory for his own fascist ideology. In conversations with diplomats and journalists, Il Duce presented himself as Hitler's mentor, the man who had opened the way. And there was some truth to that. Hitler himself acknowledged it, at least in private. But in private, Mussolini also despised Hitler. He considered him a boorish, fanatical man, without culture, without refinement. After reading Mein Kampf, Mussolini called it a boring brick that I have never been able to read completely, and his racial theories seemed stupid and barbaric. Mussolini considered himself an intellectual, a man of letters, a political thinker. Hitler seemed to him a beer hall demagogue, a clumsy imitator of his own ideas. And then there was Austria. Always Austria. On June 14th, 1934, Hitler and Mussolini met face to face for the first time in Venice. The political and epistolary relationship between them had begun in 1923, when Hitler wrote that letter praising the March on Rome, but 11 years had passed without them meeting in person. The meeting was awkward, almost comical. Hitler arrived in Venice dressed in a wrinkled trench coat and a soft hat, while Mussolini received him in his impeccable fascist uniform, surrounded by soldiers with feathers and decorations. The visual difference was brutal. Mussolini, accustomed to dominating any room he entered, found himself in front of a man who talked non-stop, who gestured with a disturbing intensity, and who seemed incapable of listening. The conversations were about the Austrian question, as Hitler sought the annexation of that country, but Mussolini firmly opposed it. Austria had to remain independent as a buffer state between Italy and Germany. Hitler left Venice having achieved nothing, and 6 weeks later, something happened that brought the relationship to the brink of rupture. On July 25, 1934, a group of Austrian Nazis stormed the Chancellery in Vienna and attempted a coup d'etat. In the assault, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, Mussolini's ally and personal friend of the Italian dictator, was assassinated with 2 shots. Hitler had given at least his tacit approval to the coup, although evidence of his direct involvement in it is still debated. What is not debated is Mussolini's reaction. Il Duce flew into a rage. Dollfuss was visiting Mussolini's wife and children at his summer residence in Riccione when the news of the coup arrived. Mussolini had to give the terrible news to the widow. He mobilized 4 divisions of the Italian army on the Brenner border, sending an unequivocal signal to Berlin. If Germany tried to annex Austria, Italy would respond with force. Hitler backed down. The coup failed. Austria remained independent for the moment, and the relationship between the 2 dictators was deeply damaged. In private, Mussolini uttered some of the harshest phrases an Axis leader would ever say about another. According to several testimonies collected by historians, Mussolini called Hitler a murderer and a horrible sexual degenerate. He said that the Germans were descendants of the barbarians who did not know how to read or write when Rome had Caesar, Virgil, and Augustus. And on the Nazi concept of the Aryan race, he declared with sarcasm, "Every time Hitler occupies a country, he sends me a message, but I send him a message every time I need one." Remember that in our Mediterranean race, we had a civilization when your ancestors lived in mud huts. Could this hostility have been permanent? Could Mussolini have chosen to ally with France and Great Britain against the Nazi threat and change the course of history? The short answer is yes, it was possible. And the fact that it did not happen is due to a series of catastrophic decisions that Mussolini made from 1935 onwards. Decisions that pushed him inexorably into Hitler's arms. Mussolini's first fatal mistake was Ethiopia, the second was Spain, and the third was vanity. For years, Mussolini had dreamed of building an Italian colonial empire to rival those of France and Great Britain. Italy had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Ethiopia in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a national trauma that Mussolini wanted to avenge. Moreover, Ethiopia was one of the few African territories that had not been colonized by a European power, and Mussolini saw it as an easy prey. In October 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. It was a brutal, asymmetrical war in which the Italian army, equipped with planes, tanks, artillery, and crucially, chemical weapons prohibited by the Geneva Convention, crushed the forces of Emperor Haile Selassie. The Italians used mustard gas on a large scale, bombed Red Cross hospitals, massacred prisoners and civilians. In May 1936, Mussolini triumphantly proclaimed the creation of the Italian Empire of East Africa. The international reaction was one of condemnation, but ineffective. The League of Nations imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but these were lukewarm and did not include an oil embargo, the resource Italy needed to fuel its war machine. France and Great Britain, fearful of pushing Mussolini toward Hitler, attempted a secret agreement, the Horror-Laval Plan, which would have given 2/3 of Ethiopia to Italy in exchange for peace. When the plan was leaked to the press, the scandal was enormous, and the 2 responsible foreign ministers had to resign, but the damage was done. Mussolini interpreted the weakness of the democracies as cowardice, and the condemnation of the League of Nations as hypocrisy. And who was the only important European leader who did not condemn the invasion of Ethiopia? Adolf Hitler. Germany did not participate in the sanctions. Hitler saw in the Ethiopian crisis a golden opportunity to draw Mussolini into his orbit, and he seized it with Machiavellian skill. While France and Great Britain scolded Mussolini, Hitler offered him understanding, support, and the prospect of an alliance of equals. It was a pivotal moment. The League of Nations sanctions, although materially ineffective, had a devastating political effect. They pushed Mussolini toward Germany. If the Western democracies rejected him, he would seek another ally, and that ally was in Berlin, waiting for him with open arms. On November 1st, 1936, in a speech delivered in Milan, Mussolini uttered for the first time the expression that would define the alliance between Italy and Germany, the Rome-Berlin axis. It was not yet a formal military alliance, but a declaration of political and ideological affinity. But the meaning was clear. The two fascist regimes of Europe were aligning against the Western democracies and against the Soviet Union. How did Mussolini go from mobilizing troops against Hitler over Austria to proclaiming an alliance with him in just 2 years? The answer lies in the calculation of power. Mussolini concluded that Italy, alone, could not compete with France and Great Britain. He needed a strong ally, and the only one available was Germany. Moreover, Hitler's growing success in European politics, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, which France and Great Britain tolerated without response, proved it, made the alliance with Berlin increasingly attractive. And then came Spain, the testing ground where the Rome-Berlin axis was forged in blood. When General Francisco Franco rebelled against the Spanish Republic in July 1936, both Mussolini and Hitler came to his aid. Italy sent between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, as well as planes, artillery, and war material. Germany sent the Condor Legion, an air force that became infamous for the bombing of Guernica in April 1937. The Spanish Civil War became a dress rehearsal for the Second World War, and the cooperation between Italy and Germany in support of Franco strengthened the ties between the two regimes in a way that diplomacy alone could never have achieved. Italian and German soldiers fought together, trained together, and developed joint tactics. Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's Wehrmacht officers shared trenches and battle maps. And in the chancelleries of Rome and Berlin, the diplomats and military of both countries began to coordinate their foreign policies in an increasingly close manner. The Spanish Civil War facilitated the alliance between Hitler and Mussolini in a way that no other event could have achieved. It was the moment when the relationship moved from ideological affinity to active military cooperation. But the piece missing from the puzzle was Austria, because as Mussolini and Hitler grew closer, the shadow of the Austrian question still hung over the relationship like a sword of Damocles. In March 1938, Hitler finally decided to act. After months of diplomatic pressure, military threats, and internal subversion by the Austrian Nazis, German troops crossed the Austrian border on March 12, 1938. There was no resistance. The Austrian army stayed in its barracks. The population, or at least a significant part of it, received the German soldiers with flowers and swastika flags. Hitler entered Vienna in a triumphal parade and proclaimed the annexation of Austria to the German Reich, the Anschluss. And Mussolini, the man who 4 years earlier had mobilized divisions on the Brenner Pass to prevent exactly this, what did he do? Nothing. He did absolutely nothing. He sent no troops. He issued no ultimatum. He did not protest. When the German ambassador formally communicated the annexation, Mussolini responded with a forced smile and said he accepted it. Hitler, upon learning of Mussolini's reaction, uttered a phrase that would become famous. "Tell Mussolini I will never forget him for this. Never, never, never." Why did Mussolini yield? Why did he abandon Austria after having sworn to defend it? The main reason was that, by 1938, Mussolini could no longer afford a confrontation with Germany. The war in Ethiopia had depleted Italy's military and financial resources. International sanctions had weakened the economy. The intervention in Spain was draining even more men and material. And Germany had rearmed on a scale that made any comparison with the Italian army ridiculous. Mussolini swallowed his pride and accepted the inevitable. But in doing so, he crossed a point of no return. From March 1938, Italy ceased to be an independent actor in European politics and became, increasingly, the junior partner of Nazi Germany. The master had become the subordinate of his student. The irony was crushing. The man who had invented fascism, the leader whom Hitler had admired and imitated for years, the model that had inspired the creation of Nazism, was now in the shadow of his own creature. Mussolini knew it, and it hurt him deeply. In September 1937, Mussolini had visited Hitler in Germany. What he saw there left him both dazzled and terrified. Hitler organised a colossal spectacle for him: military parades with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, demonstrations of industrial might in the Krupp factories in Essen, mass rallies in Berlin, where 1 million people chanted the names of the two dictators. Germany's military and economic apparatus was colossal, incomparably superior to Italy's. Mussolini returned to Rome impressed, and according to several testimonies, depressed. He understood that Italy could not compete with Germany, but instead of distancing himself from Hitler, as logic would have advised, he decided to get closer, believing that the only way for Italy to matter in the new Europe was to tie itself to the stronger one's chariot. It was the decision that sealed the fate of Italy and that of millions of people. But there is something that many do not know about the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler, something that reveals the depth of the influence the German leader exerted on the Italian, even on issues where Mussolini had shown independence of judgment for decades. It is about the racial laws. In 1938, the Italian fascist regime approved the racial laws, a set of anti-Semitic provisions that prohibited marriages between Italians and Jews, excluded Jews from schools, universities, the army and public administration, and severely restricted their economic and social life. Why? Why did Mussolini, the man who in 1932 had said that race is a feeling, not a reality, who had mocked biological racism as stupidity, who had had a Jewish mistress, Jewish collaborators, and Jewish followers, why did that same man approve anti-Semitic laws that destroyed the lives of approximately 50,000 Italian Jews? The most direct answer is because of Hitler. Not because Hitler ordered him to, at least not directly, but because Mussolini, increasingly dependent on the alliance with Germany, felt the need to align Italy's domestic policy with that of its more powerful partner. If the German Reich had racial laws, Italy would have them too. It was a demonstration of ideological solidarity, a gesture of alignment that consolidated the Axis. But there were also internal motivations. Mussolini wanted to radicalize Italian fascism, which he considered too soft compared to Nazism. He wanted to create a new man, fascist, hardened, purified, and racism seemed to him a useful instrument for that social engineering project. Moreover, the conquest of Ethiopia had created the need for a racial policy to keep Italian colonists separate from the African populations, and the anti-Semitic laws were inscribed in that broader framework of racial legislation. Whatever the combination of motives, the consequences were devastating for Italian Jews, a community that had lived in Italy for centuries, that had integrated deeply into Italian society, that had contributed to science, the arts, commerce, even to the fascist movement itself, suddenly found itself turned into a pariah. They lost their jobs, their properties, their rights. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jewish war veterans, men who had shed their blood for Italy in the First World War, were stripped of their medals and their dignity. And the worst was yet to come. When years later, Germany occupied northern Italy, the Nazi machinery of the Holocaust extended to Italian territory, and thousands of Italian Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. The 1938 racial laws had prepared the ground. They had identified the Jews, had separated them from society, had marked them. When the Germans arrived, the list was already made. This is how racial anti-Semitism, the most lethal creation of Nazism, spread to Italian fascism through the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini. The student had corrupted the master. In May 1939, the alliance between Hitler and Mussolini took another definitive step with the signing of the Pact of Steel, a military alliance treaty that committed Italy and Germany to provide each other with military and economic aid in case of war. The official name was Pact of Friendship and Alliance between Germany and Italy, but it was the Italian Foreign Minister, Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, who christened it the Pact of Steel to emphasize its solidity. But there was a fundamental problem with the pact, a problem that revealed the growing asymmetry in the relationship between the two dictators. Mussolini had insisted that Italy needed at least 3 more years to prepare militarily for a European war. The Italian army was large in numbers, but deficient in modern equipment. It lacked tanks, planes, heavy artillery, and above all, raw materials like oil, steel, and coal. Mussolini wanted the pact to include a clause that would delay any conflict until at least 1942. Hitler agreed verbally, but had no intention of waiting. In late August 1939, Hitler wrote to Mussolini informing him that the war with Poland was imminent and that he expected Italy's support. Mussolini found himself in an agonizing dilemma. He knew that Italy was not prepared for war. He knew that entering a European conflict at that moment would be disastrous. But he also knew that refusing to support Germany would mean humiliation and possibly the rupture of the alliance. In the end, Mussolini opted to declare Italy's non-belligerence, a euphemism that avoided the word neutrality so as not to seem cowardly. Italy would not enter the war for the moment, but it would not oppose Germany either. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun, and Hitler had started it without consulting his ally. The master had been ignored by the student. But why did Mussolini, despite knowing that Italy was not ready, end up entering the war? What pushed him to make a decision that would destroy his regime, his country, and his own life? The answer has to do with vanity, opportunistic calculation, and the fear of becoming irrelevant. During the first months of the war, Hitler accumulated victory after victory with a speed that astonished the world. Poland fell in less than a month. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. And on May 10th, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched its Western offensive against France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. What happened next was one of the most spectacular military victories in history. In just 6 weeks, the German army overran the Allied forces, surrounded the French army and the British Expeditionary Force, forced them into a desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, and occupied Paris. France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. The greatest military power in continental Europe had been humiliated and defeated in record time. Mussolini contemplated the fall of France with a mixture of astonishment and panic. Astonishment at the German military might, which had surpassed all predictions, and panic at the possibility that the war would end before Italy could participate in it. Because if Germany won the war without Italy, Italy would have no right to sit at the table of victors. There would be no territories to divide, no glory to share. Mussolini would be left as a cowardly spectator who had stayed on the sidelines while his ally reshaped the map of Europe. On June 10th, 1940, when France was already on the verge of collapse, Mussolini declared war on France and Great Britain. From the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, before a crowd that, according to chroniclers, was more confused than enthusiastic, Mussolini delivered a grandiloquent speech. The hour of irrevocable decisions has come. The declaration of war has been sent to the ambassadors of Great Britain and France. It was an act of pure opportunism. Mussolini wanted to sit at the banquet table without having cooked anything. President Roosevelt of the United States uttered a phrase that would perfectly capture the world's opinion. The hand that held the dagger has plunged it into the back of its neighbour. But Mussolini's opportunism crashed against reality. The brief Italian campaign against France was a fiasco. The Italian troops barely advanced a few kilometres against a French resistance that, despite being defeated in the north, continued to fight in the Alps. And what would come next would be infinitely worse. Italy's entry into the war revealed a truth that Mussolini had tried to hide for years, that Italian military power was a facade. Behind the spectacular parades, the showy uniforms, and the grandiloquent speeches, the Italian army lacked the means to wage a modern war against advanced industrial powers. The Italian invasion of Greece in October 1940 was the most humiliating demonstration of this reality. Mussolini decided to attack Greece without consulting Hitler, partly as an act of asserting independence. If Hitler could invade countries without warning him, he could do the same. The Italian dictator expected a quick and easy victory over a small and supposedly weak country. He was spectacularly wrong. The Greek troops, motivated and well led, not only stopped the Italian offensive, but also repelled it, chasing the Italians back to Albania and threatening to expel them from the Balkans. It was a military debacle that made the whole world laugh at Italy's expense, and that enraged Hitler, who was forced to intervene to save his ally. When Hitler arrived in Florence on October 28, 1940, to meet with Mussolini, he learned that a few hours earlier the Italian attack on Greece had begun. No one had warned him. The expression on Hitler's face, according to witnesses, was one of contained fury. But he said nothing in public. He needed Mussolini, at least for the moment, and could not afford a rupture. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, conquering both countries in a matter of weeks, and rescuing Italy from a total humiliation. But the price was high. The Balkan campaign delayed Hitler's most ambitious operation, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, which was scheduled for May 1941 and had to be postponed until June 22nd. Some historians have argued that those lost weeks were crucial, that if Barbarossa had started earlier, the German army would have reached Moscow before the Russian winter, and the history of the Second World War might have been different. Is it possible that Mussolini's military incompetence contributed indirectly to Hitler's defeat? It's a fascinating hypothesis, though impossible to prove. What is certain is that, from 1941, the relationship between the two dictators changed its nature irreversibly. There was no longer even the pretense of equality. Italy had become what German diplomats disparagingly called the dead weight of the Axis. And here we must pause, because the story of how Mussolini inspired Hitler to create Nazism would not be complete without examining what happened when the creation surpassed the creator, when the student no longer needed the master, when the monster broke free from its Frankenstein. Because that is exactly what happened between 1941 and 1943. Hitler, engaged in his war of conquest and extermination, dragged Italy into conflicts for which it was not prepared. Italian troops fought in North Africa, where they were defeated by the British. They fought in Russia, where the Italian expeditionary force was annihilated in the Battle of Stalingrad and in the Soviet Don offensive. They fought in the Balkans, where the partisan guerrilla harassed them without rest. Meanwhile, Allied bombings devastated Italian cities. Rome, Milan, Turin, Naples, and Genoa suffered airstrikes that destroyed factories, homes, infrastructure, and lives. The Italian population, which had never felt genuine enthusiasm for the war, began to turn openly against the regime. And then, on July 10th, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. It was the beginning of the end for Mussolini. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council, the party's supreme body, voted a motion of no confidence against Mussolini. It was the first and only time that Il Duce was formally challenged by his own party. King Victor Emmanuel III, the same monarch who had handed him power 21 years earlier, dismissed him and ordered his arrest. Mussolini was taken from the Palazzo Venezia in an ambulance, like a prisoner, and transferred to a series of detention centres in southern and central Italy. Italian fascism, the movement that Mussolini had created from scratch, the model that had inspired Nazism, collapsed like a house of cards. Years of propaganda, of parades, of grandiloquent speeches, of believe, obey, fight. And a vote and a royal decree were enough for everything to disappear. Mussolini's statues were torn down. The portraits were ripped from the walls. The fascist insignia were trampled. The Italian people, who for 2 decades had acclaimed Il Duce, celebrated his fall with a relief that bordered on euphoria. But was that the end of Mussolini? No, because Hitler was not willing to abandon his former master. On September 12, 1943, a commando of German paratroopers led by Otto Skorzeny, an SS officer known for his audacity and brutality, executed one of the most spectacular rescue operations of the war. In a mission called Operation Oak, the Germans landed with gliders on the Gran Sasso, a mountain in the Apennines, where Mussolini was held captive in an isolated hotel. Without firing a single shot, the Germans overwhelmed the Italian guards, rescued Mussolini, and flew him out of there in a light aircraft. Hitler had personally ordered the operation. He did not do it out of friendship, or at least not only for friendship. He did it for calculation. He needed Mussolini as a figurehead to legitimize the German occupation of northern Italy, which the Wehrmacht armies had taken after the new Italian government signed an armistice with the Allies. Mussolini was installed as leader of a puppet state called the Italian Social Republic, based in Salo, on the shores of Lake Garda. He was a ghost of what he had been. The man who had dominated Italy for 2 decades, the inventor of fascism, Hitler's model, had become a puppet of the Germans, a prisoner disguised as a president, a sick and exhausted old man who signed decrees he had no power to enforce. The Germans controlled everything: the troops, the economy, the foreign policy. Mussolini decided nothing. He received orders from Berlin and obeyed them. The creator of fascism had ended up as a subordinate of Nazism, the ideology he himself had engendered. And it was during this period, under the Republic of Salo, that something happened that forever stained Mussolini's legacy: the deportation of Italian Jews to Nazi extermination camps. Between September 1943 and April 1945, more than 8,000 Italian Jews were deported, mainly to Auschwitz. Only about 1,000 survived. The machinery of the Holocaust, the most monstrous creation of Nazism, had extended to Italy, with the complicity of the regime that Mussolini nominally headed. The man who in 1932 had mocked biological racism ended up presiding over a regime that actively collaborated in the extermination of its own Jewish citizens. There is no darker irony. And how did it all end? What was the final fate of the 2 men whose relationship changed the course of history? The last months of the war were a nightmare for both. Hitler, locked in his bunker under the Chancellery in Berlin, surrounded by ruins, rejecting the reality of defeat with a demented stubbornness, moved non-existent armies on the map and dictated orders that no one could obey. Mussolini, in Salo, desperately tried to find a way out, negotiate with the Allies, make a deal with the partisans, flee to Switzerland. Everything failed. On April 25, 1945, the National Liberation Committee of Northern Italy ordered a general insurrection. The partisans took the main cities of the north: Milan, Turin, Genoa, Bologna. The German forces in Italy, facing imminent surrender, began to disintegrate. Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland with a column of vehicles that was transporting the last fascist hierarchs, their families, and a cargo of documents and money. On April 27th, near Lake Como, a partisan patrol stopped the column. Mussolini was discovered hidden in the back of a German truck, dressed in a Wehrmacht coat and a German soldier's helmet, trying to pass for a German military man. He was arrested along with his lover, Clara Petacci. The next day, April 28th, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were shot by a group of communist partisans in Giuliano di Mezzegra, a small village by Lake Como The exact details of the execution are still a matter of controversy. Who gave the order? Who fired? Whether there was a summary trial or a cold-blooded murder. What is not debated is what came next. The bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and other fascist hierarchs were transported to Milan and hung upside down from a steel girder at the Piazzale Loreto service station. A furious crowd beat them, spat on them, insulted them. The photographs of the hanging bodies went around the world. It was the most humiliating end possible for a man who had dreamed of resurrecting the glory of the Roman Empire. 2 days later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, along with Eva Braun, his wife of just 36 hours. He shot himself in the temple with a Walther PPK 7.65mm pistol. His body was taken to the Chancery Garden and burned with gasoline, according to his instructions, to prevent it from being exhibited as a trophy, as had happened to Mussolini. Hitler had seen the photographs of Piazzale Loreto and was determined not to suffer the same fate. The master and the student, the creator and the creature, the man who invented fascism and the man who took it to its most extreme and deadly expression. They died 2 days apart in April 1945, when the Europe they had tried to dominate was in ruins. And what does this story leave us? What lessons can be drawn from the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler? The first and most evident is that ideas have consequences. When Mussolini founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in March 1919, he probably did not imagine that he was creating a template that would be copied, radicalized, and converted into an instrument of genocide. But that is exactly what happened. Italian fascism was the prototype of German Nazism. Without Mussolini, Hitler would have been an agitator without a model. Without the March on Rome, there would have been no beer hall putsch. Without the black shirts, there would have been no brown shirts. Without Il Duce, there would have been no Führer. The second lesson is that political imitation can be more dangerous than innovation. Mussolini was an innovator. He created something that did not exist before, but Hitler was an imitator who perfected the model, radicalized it, and took it to extremes that the original never contemplated. Genocidal anti-Semitism, the war of extermination in Eastern Europe, the Holocaust. None of these horrors were in Mussolini's original plan. They were Hitler's own contributions to a model he had borrowed. The copy was worse than the original. The third lesson is that dictators do not control the forces they unleash. Mussolini created an ideology of violence, authoritarianism, and aggressive nationalism. When that ideology expanded to Germany and fused with Hitler's racial anti-Semitism, it transformed into something that Mussolini could not control, and that, in the end, destroyed him. The alliance with Hitler, far from strengthening Italy, dragged it into a war it could not win, and to a national catastrophe without precedents. And the fourth lesson, perhaps the most disturbing, is that all this began with words, with speeches in beer halls, with articles in newspapers, with promises of national greatness, with the designation of enemies, with the glorification of violence. Before the tanks, before the bombardments, before the extermination camps, there were words, and those words, uttered by charismatic men to desperate audiences, lit a fire that consumed millions of people. Fascism was not born as a visible monster. It was born as an idea that promised order in chaos, greatness in humiliation, strength in weakness. And that is exactly the reason why it is so dangerous. But the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler has ramifications that go far beyond what we have told so far, because the influence was not just in one direction, from the master to the student. As Hitler's power grew, the influence was reversed, and it was Nazism that began to mould Italian fascism, transforming it into something darker and more lethal than what Mussolini had originally conceived. We have already seen how the 1938 racial laws were a clear example of this inverse influence. But there are other lesser-known aspects that deserve to be explored, because they reveal to what extent the relationship between the two dictators transformed not only the politics, but also the culture, society, and daily life of millions of people in both countries. One of these aspects is the militarization of civil society. Mussolini had created youth organizations like the Opera Nazionale Ballida, founded in 1926, which framed Italian children and youth in a paramilitary structure with uniforms, parades, physical exercises, and ideological indoctrination. The idea was to create the new man, a fascist, a strong, obedient, patriotic Italian prepared for war. Hitler copied this idea with the Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, founded in 1926 but transformed into a mandatory mass organization from 1936. And here the influence became circular. When Mussolini saw the success of the Hitler Youth, which by the late 1930s encompassed practically all German youth, he decided to radicalize his own youth organizations. In 1937, the Opera Nazionale Ballida was replaced by the Gioventù Italiana del Littorio, GIL, a more militarized and more ideologically rigid organization, which deliberately imitated aspects of the Hitler Youth. The same pattern was repeated in other areas. Mussolini created the Ovra, the fascist secret police. Hitler created the Gestapo, much more efficient and more brutal. Mussolini saw the Gestapo and decided to strengthen the Ovra. Mussolini created the corporatist system of economic organization. Hitler created the German Labour Front. The two systems fed each other in a spiral of radicalization. Propaganda was another field where the reciprocal influence was especially visible. Mussolini was a pioneer in the use of mass media for political propaganda. He controlled the press, the radio, the cinema, and even created the Luce Institute, which produced newsreels that were obligatorily shown in all Italian cinemas before each film. Hitler, through Goebbels, took propaganda to an unprecedented level of sophistication. He not only controlled the media, but turned them into an instrument of systematic psychological manipulation, using techniques of repetition, simplification, and emotional appeal that transformed propaganda into a sinister art. And when Mussolini saw what Goebbels was doing in Germany, he tried to imitate it. Italian propaganda of the late 1930s became more aggressive, more monolithic, more intolerant of any dissent. Mussolini's personality cult, which had always been strong, became almost religious under the influence of the Hitlerian model. Mussolini began to demand that he be called always right, and that his image appear in every classroom, every office, every factory in Italy. And isn't it frightening that the creator ended up imitating his own creature? Because that is exactly what happened. Mussolini, the man who had invented fascism, the leader whom Hitler had copied step by step, ended up copying Hitler. The master became a student of his own student. The influence that had flowed from Rome to Berlin began to flow from Berlin to Rome. And in that closed circuit of mutual imitation, both regimes radicalized to extremes that neither would have reached separately. Historians have called this phenomenon cumulative radicalization, and it is one of the keys to understanding why fascism and Nazism became increasingly violent, increasingly extreme, increasingly destructive as the 1930s progressed. It was not just that each regime radicalized internally, they radicalized each other in an upward spiral of competition to see who was tougher, purer, more implacable. But let's pause here for a moment, because there is an aspect of this relationship that is almost never told, a detail that reveals the more human, more pathetic, and more revealing dimension of the dynamic between these two men. It's about the gifts. Yes, gifts. Hitler and Mussolini sent each other gifts like two medieval monarchs, sealing a dynastic alliance. And the gifts they chose said a lot about how they saw themselves and how they saw each other. When Hitler visited Italy in May 1938, he gave Mussolini an armoured Mercedes-Benz car, the latest model from the German automotive industry, a symbol of the Reich's technological might. The message was clear. Germany was a first-rate industrial power, capable of producing the most advanced machines in the world. It was a gift that said, Look what we are capable of doing. Mussolini, in contrast, gave works of art, Roman statues, reproductions of classical frescoes, archaeological pieces. The message was equally clear, but it pointed in another direction. Italy had culture, it had history, it had a millennial civilization that Germany could not match. It was a gift that said, remember where European civilization comes from. But behind the gifts there was a fierce competition for prestige. Each state visit between the two dictators was a spectacle of rivalry disguised as friendship. When Mussolini visited Germany in September 1937, Hitler organized military parades with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, demonstrations of tanks and planes, and a mass rally in Berlin where more than 1 million people acclaimed the two leaders. Mussolini was so impressed that, according to several testimonies, he returned to Rome convinced that Italy needed to militarize even more so as not to be relegated to the role of a junior partner. And do you know what Mussolini said after seeing those parades? According to the documentary about their relationship, he declared enthusiastically, "The German people are incredible. After this, Hitler can do whatever he wants." Those words, uttered with genuine admiration, were prophetic. Hitler would do exactly what he wanted, and Mussolini would pay the consequences. When it was Hitler's turn to visit Italy in May 1938, Mussolini tried to return the favour with an equally impressive spectacle. He organised a naval review in the Gulf of Naples, with the entire Italian fleet deployed in formation. It was a visually stunning show, with dozens of warships lined up under the Mediterranean sun. But it was, like so many things in fascist Italy, more facade than substance. The Italian Navy looked imposing on review, but it lacked modern aircraft carriers, radar, and real combat experience. Hitler, however, was delighted, not because he believed the Italian Navy was formidable, but because the visit served to consolidate the alliance. As the documentary points out, Hitler was happy because the Duce was also happy. It was a phrase that perfectly summarized the dynamic of the relationship. Hitler needed Mussolini to feel important to keep him as an ally, even though in reality he considered him an increasingly useless subordinate. But when exactly did the illusion of equality break? When did Mussolini stop being a partner to become a vassal? There is a precise moment, an instant captured on film, that several historians have pointed to as the point of no return. It was during Mussolini's visit to Germany in 1937, as he watched the military parades, as he listened to the roar of the tank engines, and saw the sky darkened by the Luftwaffe planes. Mussolini understood something that changed everything. He understood that Italy could not compete, that the power difference between Germany and Italy was not a matter of political will or patriotic rhetoric, but of industrial, technological, and military capacity. Germany produced steel, coal, machinery, and armaments in quantities that Italy could not even dream of. In those seconds of jubilation, he knew he had lost, notes the documentary about their relationship. These moments in Berlin were perhaps the seed for his terrible end that would occur 8 years later at a gas station in Milan. That observation is extraordinarily penetrating, because the fall of Mussolini did not begin in July 1943, when he was dismissed by the Fascist Grand Council. It did not begin with the defeat in Greece or with the disaster in North Africa. It began in September 1937, on a stand of honour in Berlin, when Mussolini contemplated German power and understood that he had chained himself to a monster he could no longer control. From that moment on, as the document says, the Duce would be 100% compliant with Hitler. He no longer argued, he no longer opposed, he no longer tried to mark an independent line. He accepted whatever Hitler decided, because the alternative was confrontation with a power that would crush him. And that complacency had immediate and terrible consequences. After the 1937 visit, Mussolini reinforced the Italian anti-Semitic laws, aligning himself with Nazi racial policy. Later, he accepted the Anschluss without resistance. Later, he signed the Pact of Steel. Later, he entered the war. Each step sank him deeper interdependence on Hitler, and each step brought Italy closer to disaster. Now, there is an episode that illustrates like no other the psychological complexity of this relationship. An episode that combines vanity, rivalry, calculation, and paranoia in a way that seems taken from a spy novel. It is the Munich Conference of September 1938. For those who do not know the details, the Munich Conference was the culminating moment of the policy of appeasement that France and Great Britain adopted in the face of Hitler's expansionist demands. The problem was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a majority German-speaking population that Hitler claimed for the Reich. Hitler threatened to invade Czechoslovakia. If the Sudetenland was not handed over to him, Europe was on the brink of war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier travelled to Munich to negotiate with Hitler. But who acted as mediator? Mussolini. Il Duce presented himself in Munich as the peacemaker of Europe, the man who could talk to both the democracies and Hitler, the indispensable statesman who would prevent war. In reality, the proposal that Mussolini presented as his in Munich had been drafted in Berlin by German diplomats. Hitler had given Mussolini the script, and Mussolini read it as if it were his own. The British and the French, relieved to find a way out that would avoid war, accepted. Czechoslovakia was forced to cede the Sudetenland without anyone consulting it. It was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. Chamberlain returned to London waving a paper signed by Hitler and proclaiming that he had achieved peace for our time. Mussolini returned to Rome as a hero, acclaimed by crowds celebrating peace. Mussolini's prestige was at its peak, the documentary notes. But it was all a farce. Hitler had no intention of respecting the Munich Agreement. 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops marched into Prague and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, flagrantly violating the pact. The world was approaching a new era in which Hitler followed his own rules. War. And Mussolini, once again, he did nothing. The man who had acted as a mediator, who had presented himself as a guarantor of peace, was exposed as an accomplice of Hitlerian aggression. His international credibility evaporated. And what is worse, he realised that Hitler had used him as a piece in his game, as an actor reading a script written by another. The humiliation was profound, but Mussolini swallowed it in silence. Why? Because he no longer had an alternative. Italy had become, as the document says, a vassal of the Third Reich. And then came the Pact of Steel, signed on May 22, 1939. It was the definitive formalisation of the alliance, a military support treaty that, as has been noted, did not distinguish between defence and attack. In other words, if Germany attacked another country, Italy was obliged to enter the war on the German side. It was a suicidal commitment for Italy, a country that had neither the resources nor the military capacity for a European war. The Italian Foreign Minister, Galeazzo Ciano, who was also Mussolini's son-in-law, opposed the pact. Ciano was an intelligent and cynical diplomat who understood perfectly that Italy was walking into a trap. In his diary, which would be published after the war and become one of the most revealing documents of the period, Ciano wrote with bitterness that the Pact of Steel was a death sentence for Italy. From then on, as the documentary notes, Mussolini would go hand in hand with Hitler to the end, just as he had declared with much enthusiasm. But to what extent was it genuine enthusiasm, and to what extent was it disguised resignation? This is a question that historians have debated for decades. Some argue that Mussolini truly believed in the alliance with Hitler and fought that together. They could reconfigure the map of Europe for their mutual benefit. Others maintain that Mussolini felt trapped, that he knew the alliance was dangerous, but saw no viable way out. The truth, as often happens in history, is probably somewhere in the middle. Mussolini had moments of genuine enthusiasm, especially when Hitler obtained spectacular victories like the conquest of France. But he also had moments of terrifying lucidity, in which he understood that he was tying Italy's destiny to that of a man whose ambition had no limits and whose judgment was increasingly erratic. The tragic thing is that, regardless of what Mussolini felt in his heart of hearts, the consequences of his decisions were devastating. Italy entered a war for which it was not prepared. It lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Its cities were bombed. Its economy was destroyed. Its people suffered hunger, fear, and humiliation. And in the end, Mussolini himself paid with his life. But did the story really end there? Did the ideas they had engendered die with Mussolini and Hitler? The answer, unfortunately, is more complicated than we would like, because fascism and Nazism, as ideologies, survived their creators. Not in their original form, of course. There were no new marches on Rome or new beer hall putsches, but the central ideas, extreme nationalism, the cult of the charismatic leader, contempt for parliamentary democracy, the designation of minority groups as scapegoats, the glorification of political violence. These ideas did not die in April 1945. They mutated, they adapted, they disguised themselves in new clothes. In the decades after the war, neo-fascist and neo-Nazi movements emerged all over the world, from the skinhead groups in Western Europe to the far-right movements in Latin America, from the ultra-nationalist parties in Eastern Europe to the white supremacist militias in the United States. None of these movements achieved the absolute power that Mussolini and Hitler reached, but they kept alive a flame that the founders of fascism would have immediately recognized. And in the 21st century, as numerous analysts and academics have pointed out, the echoes of fascism resonate again. The resurgence of far-right populist movements in Europe and America, with their anti-immigrant rhetoric, their contempt for democratic institutions, their cult of strong leaders, and their manipulation of mass emotions through social media, is eerily reminiscent of the conditions that allowed the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 20s and 30s of the last century. Does this mean we are condemned to repeat history? Not necessarily, but it does mean that the story of Mussolini and Hitler is not just a lesson from the past, it is a warning for the present. Let us now return to the heart of our story, because there is a chapter that we have not yet told in the detail it deserves, the chapter of the personal encounters between Hitler and Mussolini. Those moments when the two dictators were face to face and where the power dynamic between them became visible in the rawest way. We have already mentioned the first meeting in Venice in June 1934, but there were many more. It is estimated that Hitler and Mussolini met at least 17 times between 1934 and 1944. Each encounter was an exercise in diplomacy, rivalry, political theatre, and at times involuntary comedy. The Venice meeting was the most revealing of all, because it was the moment when both leaders took each other's measure for the first time. Mussolini, who had been in power for 12 years and considered himself the dean of European dictators, expected to meet a minor politician who would pay him homage. Hitler, who had just consolidated his power in Germany, arrived with a mixture of admiration and nervousness. What happened was that Hitler talked non-stop, for hours, about the Aryan race, about the destiny of Germany, about the need to destroy Marxism, about the Jewish question, about living space. Mussolini, who spoke acceptable but not perfect German, tried to intervene several times, but was overwhelmed by Hitler's verbal torrent. According to the testimonies of those present, Mussolini left the meeting irritated and disconcerted. "He is an exalted monk," Mussolini said of Hitler after Venice. And on another occasion, according to multiple sources, he described him as a gramophone with only 7 records, and when it has played them all, it starts again from the beginning. But what bothered Mussolini most was the theory of the superiority of the Aryan race that Hitler expounded during the meeting. Because that theory, which placed the Germans at the pinnacle of the racial hierarchy, left the Italians, a Mediterranean people, in an ambiguous, if not directly inferior, position. Mussolini, who prided himself on being the heir of Roman civilization, could not accept that an Austrian was telling him that the peoples of the north were racially superior to those of the south. This racial tension was one of the most fascinating contradictions of the alliance between fascism and Nazism. Original Italian fascism was not racist in the biological sense. Mussolini considered himself a nationalist, not a racial supremacist. For him, the greatness of Italy was based on its civilization, its culture, and its history, not on the genetics of its inhabitants. Hitler, on the other hand, saw everything through the prism of race, and when he tried to apply his racial scheme to Italy, he clashed with the reality that his most important allies did not fit into his own hierarchy. It is a delicious and terrible irony at the same time. Hitler, the apostle of Aryan racial purity, allied himself with a people that his own ideology considered racially inferior. Mussolini, the inventor of fascism, adopted the anti-Semitism of a man whose racial theories degraded him and his people. Let us now talk about another little-known aspect of the relationship, the cultural rivalry between the two regimes. Because the competition between Mussolini and Hitler was not limited to politics and the military. It extended to art, architecture, sports, and visual propaganda. Mussolini dreamed of making Rome the cultural capital of the world, a new version of imperial Rome that would dazzle both insiders and outsiders. He ordered the construction of gigantic monuments, imperial avenues, and public buildings that combined neoclassical style with a modern fascist aesthetic. The Foro Italico, the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, popularly known as the Square Colosseum, and the planned Universal Exhibition for 1942, EUR, were the most emblematic projects of this architectural ambition. Hitler, for his part, had his own architectural dreams, even more megalomaniacal. With his favourite architect, Albert Speer, he designed plans to rebuild Berlin as Germania, the capital of the world, with a gigantic dome capable of holding 180,000 people, and a triumphal arch that would make the one in Paris look tiny. The plans for Germania were so excessive that even Speer doubted their feasibility, but Hitler insisted that they had to be realised as a symbol of the eternity of the Thousand-Year Reich. And isn't it significant that both dictators invested so much energy in monumental architecture? Because architecture was not just aesthetics, it was propaganda in stone. Every colossal building, every imperial avenue, every ceremonial square was designed to make the small citizen feel small before the state, to remind him that the individual was nothing, and that the nation, the party, and the leader were everything. Mussolini saw in Rome the proof that Italy had had the greatest empire in ancient history, and he wanted the new fascist Rome to be on par with its predecessor. Hitler saw in Germania the materialization of his dream of an empire that would last 1,000 years. Both were building monuments to their own vanity, temples to their unbridled ambition, anticipated sepulchres of their megalomania. Because none of these projects were completed, the war destroyed the architectural dreams of both dictators. The Roman EUR was left half-built. When Italy entered the war, Germania never went beyond the models, and the only constructions that the two regimes left as a permanent legacy were the concentration camps, the bunkers, and the ruins of the cities they bombed. But what was happening in the daily life of the citizens of these two countries, while their leaders played at building empires? How did the Italians and Germans live under these regimes that promised them greatness and delivered them war? This question leads us to a dimension of history that is often lost in the grand narratives about dictators and battles, the human dimension. Because behind every political decision, behind every military alliance, behind every grandiloquent speech, there were millions of real people whose fates were determined by men they never met. In Italy, life under fascism was a contradictory mix of nationalist pride, social conformity, political repression, and gradual economic deterioration. The early years of Mussolini's regime, during the 1920s, were relatively prosperous for the middle and upper classes. Fascism provided political stability after the chaos of the Biennio Rosso, controlled the unions, repressed the communists, and offered a sense of order and discipline that many Italians, exhausted by years of agitation, appreciated. But the price was high. Political freedoms disappeared, the press was muzzled, opponents were persecuted, imprisoned, sent into confino, internal exile on islands or remote towns in southern Italy, or, in the worst cases, murdered. The most famous case was that of the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti, murdered by fascist squadristi in June 1924 after denouncing the electoral fraud of Mussolini's party. His assassination caused a political crisis that, paradoxically, ended up strengthening Mussolini. Instead of falling, Il Duce took advantage of the crisis to accelerate the establishment of the full dictatorship. In Germany, the pattern was similar but faster and more radical. The first years of the Nazi regime were perceived by many Germans as a period of recovery. Hitler launched an ambitious program of public works. The highways, or Autobahnen, were the most visible example, that drastically reduced unemployment. The armaments industry, which violated the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles but created millions of jobs, fueled an artificial economic boom. For the Aryan Germans, who were not persecuted by the regime, the first years of Nazism seemed like an economic miracle. But for those who did not fit the Nazi vision of the people's community, Volksgemeinschaft, the reality was very different. Jews were progressively excluded from public life, the economy, and society. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped them of their German citizenship and prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Communists, Social Democrats, trade unionists, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, and people with disabilities were persecuted, imprisoned, or murdered. It is estimated that some 17 million people died as a consequence of Nazi extermination policies. And here the influence of Mussolini on Hitler returns, but inverted, because the 1938 Italian anti-Semitic laws, which Mussolini adopted under the influence of the alliance with Hitler, prepared the ground for Italian participation in the Holocaust. Before 1938, Italian Jews lived integrated into society. After 1938, they were progressively marginalized, and after September 1943, when Germany occupied northern Italy, they were deported to extermination camps. The causal chain is clear and chilling. Mussolini created fascism. Hitler copied it and added genocidal biological racism. Mussolini, under Hitler's influence, adopted anti-Semitism. And when the monster they both had created ran amok, the Italian Jews, who had survived for centuries in a relatively tolerant society, were dragged into the same hell as the German, Polish, Hungarian, and all European Jews. But what was the lowest point in the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler? What was the moment when the master's humiliation at the hands of the student reached its peak? Many historians point to the meeting at Feltre on July 19th, 1943 as that moment. It was the last meeting between the two dictators on Italian territory, and it was a spectacle of degradation that summarizes the entire tragedy of the alliance. By July 1943, Italy's military situation was desperate. The Allies had landed in Sicily 9 days earlier. The Italian army was demoralized and defeated on multiple fronts. The Italian economy was in ruins. Allied bombings devastated the cities, and Mussolini, sick, exhausted, prematurely aged, knew that his regime was faltering. Mussolini travelled to Feltre, in northern Italy, with the intention of asking Hitler to allow Italy to negotiate a way out of the war. He needed to tell him that Italy could not continue fighting, that the Italian people were at their limit, that the only salvation was an armistice with the Allies. And what happened at Feltre? Hitler spoke, and spoke, and spoke, for hours, without letting Mussolini get a word in, exactly as in Venice 9 years earlier, but this time without the excuse of novelty. Hitler spoke of the military situation, of the secret weapons that would soon change the course of the war, of the need to resist at all costs, of the cowardice of the Italians, of the treason that any agreement with the Allies would entail. Mussolini listened in silence. He did not say what he had gone to say. He did not ask for peace. He did not defend his people. He sat still, motionless, while Hitler dictated the conditions of an alliance that was destroying Italy. Why didn't he speak? Why did the man who had dominated Italy for 20 years, who had intimidated kings, politicians, and generals, who had invented a political movement that changed the world, remain silent in front of a man whom he himself had considered an inferior imitator? The most probable answer is that Mussolini was already broken, physically and psychologically broken. The war, the defeats, the pressure, the illness had consumed him. The man with the prominent jaw and defiant gaze, who had marched on Rome in 1922, was now a premature old man, with stomach ulcers, chronic insomnia, and a depression he tried to hide behind a mask of bravado. 6 days after Feltre, the fascist Grand Council voted against Mussolini, and the rest, as we have told, is history. But the story did not end at Feltre. It did not even end at Piazza Loreto or in the Berlin bunker, because the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler left a legacy that transcends the lives of both men and continues to shape our world in ways we do not always recognize. What was that legacy? It can be summarized in several dimensions. The first is the demonstration that democracy is fragile. Both Italy and Germany were democracies, imperfect but functional, before Mussolini and Hitler destroyed them. Fascism and Nazism did not arise in authoritarian countries. They arose in democratic countries that were going through economic, social, and political crises. And both movements used the tools of democracy, the elections, the press, the mobilization of masses, to destroy democracy from within. The second is the demonstration that alliances between dictators are inherently unstable and destructive. The alliance between Mussolini and Hitler, despite the rhetoric of ideological brotherhood, was plagued by distrust, rivalry, and deceit. Each dictator tried to manipulate the other. Each one believed he could control the other. And in the end, both were destroyed by the alliance they had created. The third is the demonstration of the power of political imitation. Hitler copied Mussolini. Mussolini ended up copying Hitler. Other fascist movements in Spain, Portugal, Romania, Hungary, Croatia, and other countries copied them both. Political imitation created an international network of authoritarian regimes that reinforced each other and that together were capable of destabilizing the international order in a way that none of them would have achieved separately. And the fourth dimension of the legacy, perhaps the most disturbing, is the demonstration that ideas matter. Fascism began as a set of ideas in the head of a former Italian schoolteacher. It became a political movement, then a regime. Then it crossed borders and mutated into Nazism. And in the end, those ideas, born in a Milan brewery and a Munich beer hall, caused a world war that killed more than 60 million people, destroyed entire cities, produced the Holocaust, and redrew the map of the world. Ideas matter, words matter, speeches matter, the promises of national greatness, the designations of internal enemies, the calls to violence, the contempt for democratic institutions, all that matters, because all that was what Mussolini and Hitler used to get to power, and all that was what produced the catastrophe. And what about the last days of these two men? What did they feel when everything collapsed? Was there repentance? Was there lucidity? Or was there only denial until the end? Of Hitler we know, from the testimonies of those who accompanied him in the Berlin bunker, that he alternated between moments of delirium and moments of cold rage. He kept moving non-existent divisions on obsolete maps. He blamed everyone but himself, the generals for their incompetence, the German people for not being up to the historical mission he had assigned them, the Jews for the world conspiracy that had supposedly caused the war. There was no repentance. There was no admission of error, only narcissistic fury and a final act of cowardice disguised as dignity, suicide. Of Mussolini, we know less about his last thoughts, but the testimonies of those who accompanied him in his flight to Switzerland paint a bleak picture. An exhausted, confused man who carried suitcases full of documents that he hoped to use to justify himself to history. A man who alternated between the fantasy of negotiating with the Allies and the desire to surrender to the partisans. A man who, according to some testimonies, said in his last hours, "I am a finished man. My star has set." Did Mussolini think of Hitler in those final moments? Did he regret creating the model that Hitler copied and radicalized? Did he regret allying himself with the man who destroyed Italy? We do not know, and we will probably never know. What we do know is that when the partisans captured him near Lake Como on April 27th, 1945, Mussolini was dressed in a German Wehrmacht coat, trying to pass for a German soldier. The creator of Italian fascism, in his final hour, was literally disguised as a Nazi. The metaphor needs no explanation. There is one more detail, a detail that is rarely mentioned, but which has an extraordinary symbolic resonance. When Hitler learned of Mussolini's execution and the exhibition of his corpse in Piazzale Loreto, he was horrified, not out of compassion for his former ally, but out of fear of suffering the same fate. It was then that he gave the explicit order that his body be burned after his suicide, so that the Soviets could not exhibit it as a trophy. The master died first. The student, upon learning, took precautions so that his corpse would not be desecrated like the master's. Even in death, the relationship between the two men followed the same pattern. Mussolini acted first, and Hitler reacted afterwards, learning from the other's experience. Mussolini was the prototype, Hitler, the improved version, even in the way of dying. And does the story have more twists? Of course it does, because after the death of both dictators, the legacy of their relationship continued to generate consequences. In Italy, anti-fascism became the foundational pillar of the new Italian Republic, created in 1946 after a referendum that abolished the monarchy. The Italian Constitution of 1948, one of the most democratic in the world, was explicitly designed to prevent something like fascism from happening again. It prohibited the reconstitution of the fascist party. It established a system of checks and balances that limited the power of the executive. It guaranteed the fundamental rights that Mussolini had abolished. In Germany, the process was even more drastic. The Allies occupied the country, divided its territory, tried the main Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, and launched a denazification program that sought to eradicate Nazi ideology from all aspects of German life: education, public administration, the media, even everyday language. The Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, promulgated in 1949, established a robust democracy with explicit protections against totalitarianism.